Now, it's that time of the morning when we take a look at some of the stories making the headlines on the international newspaper front pages. And joining me to do that is the political commentator and broadcaster, Crispin Williams. Good morning, Crispin. Good to see you. Now, let's start with the front page of the Wall Street Journal this morning. And, of course, it's the issue that's on a lot of people's lips, especially in Europe, and that is that deal with Greece.
Yeah. Well, it's really crunch time, isn't it? There's 1 week left before the sort of 240 billion expires and Greece needs to find more money. And I think it's a tale of a sort of deterioration of relationships between Greece and Germany. Obviously, we see that Syriza have been voted in to get rid of austerity, but Germany wants that more. I think there's also some individual sides here as well. I'll try and say his name right, Schäuble, the German finance minister, was portrayed wearing a Nazi uniform in some papers in Greece, and also the Greek finance minister has been lampooned. So a bit of tension there, and also I think a tension slightly between Brussels and Berlin as well, because Brussels sort of warmly welcomed the Greek announcement just before Germany came down quite firmly, said no, this isn't good enough. And ultimately it goes down to the euro. Will the euro continue if Greece was to leave, or is Greece being integral part of that? And I think that's sort of driving the different camps in how they fight their corners.
Because Greece is trying to say that it's trying to come to an arrangement and it put a new offer on the table, but Berlin just sort of flatly refused it.
Well, there are domestic pressures, as we've sort of alluded to here, and I think on the Germany side they see the need for Greece to be more competitive in the long term, not to spend its way out of trouble, which is the more sort of left position of trying to do that there. So you're seeing that sort of jarring going forward, and I suppose it's what happens next. It's slightly a bit of chicken here. Who's going to blink next? Will Germany sort of soften a bit, or will Greece come forward with something new? But again, we've got 1 week, so there does need to be something happening in the background to try and move this forward.
Who's likely to win the brinkmanship? Because both sides have a lot to lose.
They do. I mean, you know, Germany is in the ascendancy in the EU. Merkel is seen as almost as the leader of the EU at the moment. But there are many people in the EU who see Greece as being, you know, central to the euro, that if you start to see one country move away, maybe other countries could move away as well, and that would undermine the eurozone and the euro as a whole. That's the sort of Greek card that's being subtly played here. So again, it's going to be, I think, someone else coming in, maybe from the EU side, maybe trying to put something in there that can bring them closer together. But I don't see Germany moving too far away from the austerity programme that the credit agencies and others want to have there.
Because is it delaying the inevitable? Because this has been a process that's been going on for a number of years, you know, trying to shore up Greece and its economy. Is it just delaying the inevitable that perhaps Greece will default and the economy will get even worse?
Well, some would say that. I don't necessarily think it will, but it's a problem. You've got domestic democracies, and how many governments have we had voted in to Greece now since the original crash happened, with different remits to try and sort out this problem? And if you've been voted in on a remit that you're going to tackle austerity and do something different, well, it's very hard for Tsipras to move away from that, the Greek Prime Minister. I mean, I think there is going to need to be a bit of loosening on both sides, but I don't see, as in negotiation, either side getting really what they want. But Greece won't be able to move so far away from the austerity that it's going. So, but that doesn't mean it's inevitable, it's going to fall away and we're going to have a crisis, as some might allude to.
We'll see how today's meeting plays out. Also on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, a photograph of a boy and his mother leaving an immigration centre through a fence on the Italian island of Lampedusa. There are warnings that there are going to be more migrants fleeing North Africa and heading towards Lampedusa.
Yeah. Well, I think this is important to raise this point. It's sort of happening under the radar that we've got this huge influx of refugees. We've got crises in Libya, etc., so extra refugees coming through. And I think there's been, in my opinion, a bit of a sort of step away from duty for many EU governments. For example, the UK said that it wouldn't allow its UK Navy to pick up refugees. So Italy has been left trying to deal with this escalating problem. I think they said out of 200,000 refugees who made it to the EU mainland, 170,000 went through Italy. So the EU has come forward with a 13.7 million deal to help out here, which I think is very, very needed. But this is a crisis that's going on in the background. I think we need to be paying more attention to it.
So I think there was 1,000 people who were rescued on the weekend.
Yeah, and many who don't make it. So it's a real tragedy, and we need to work on that.
Moving on to the front page of the Daily Mail, and there's no No denying what they're trying to say there with the headline, Britain at the mercy of Putin's planes.
Yeah. So this is going on. I mean, I think it was a couple of days ago, we had two old bear bombers, as they called, with propellers going off the west coast of the UK near Cornwall. The Prime Minister said it didn't dignify a response. But the former chief of the RAF, Sir Michael Graydon, has said, actually, we couldn't cope if Russia came on and really attacked us. I mean, it's the same old story from two sides here. Again, Russia, Putin, flexing the military muscles when he feels under pressure, so let's, show the UK we're not happy by sending the bombers over. But what I would say, maybe for some more of our international viewers, is that there's a tradition in the UK as well from the security chiefs that when they feel that funding has been cut, and this is both across Navy, Army and RAF, they're very vocal and they're very public in saying we can't cope. I mean, the Army, for example, had its budget massively slashed, and they're now looking to have much more of a sort of territorial army, a reserve army, rather than a frontline army. They were incredibly critical that we couldn't defend our shores. You're seeing this from the RAF, the ex-RAF person who can say because he's now not in that position. So I think there's a bit of politics and a bit of rhetoric here. They are right to say, of course, if Russia sent its full fleet against the UK and Air Force, the UK couldn't cope. But I don't really see it as being an imminent threat. I think it's more politics of trying to work at budget cuts that the defence is feeling.
And with the situation in Ukraine and concerns about Russia and its potential aggression, what sort of point is Russia really trying to make by flying planes? I know it wasn't in sovereign UK airspace, but towards the UK. And only a couple of weeks ago, they flew planes down the English Channel.
Yeah, and it's not the only country, the UK. There have been reports whether there was a Russian submarine off Sweden. Other countries have had this going through. I think a lot of this is domestic as well. It's about showing the people back home in Russia that we're still a strong country. Because remember, Russia is the superpower that was, and it was always through its military establishment. So I won't attempt to read Putin, because I think that's a very hard thing, and people better than me try and do that and don't necessarily succeed. But it is very much trying to say, we are a power, so don't dismiss us in a way by, the fact that we can keep doing this and, we can poke you in this way, I suppose you might say. But like I say, it's ageing propellered aircraft, which sort of reflects that Russia actually is struggling economically in the backdrop as well.
Does it sort of signal the prospect of a new Cold War beginning?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we heard the UK Defence Minister, Michael Fallon, saying it's actually hotting up from being a Cold War. But what is going to happen? We've seen with the ceasefire in the Ukraine now, neither side seemingly is sticking to it. We're hearing shelling on both sides. But what is Russia's agenda there? As you rightly pointed out, the three Baltic states, there's a lot of concern whether Russia and Putin will start looking towards that. So is this about trying to pay hardball to get the economic sanctions and other things off, or is this wider Russian aspirations? I think that's what people are looking at, and I don't think people have the conclusive answer.
And also, we don't know if this is playing out more to a domestic agenda in Russia to shore up Putin's leadership there.
Because Putin has always had historically high support from his population, but he's always delivered both security but also food on the table. Now with the sanctions, with the dropping oil prices, the problems with the ruble, people are really struggling. I had a colleague who's Russian who went back and said that he went into a shop. Actually, by the time he reached the counter, he was told that the price had changed because of the varying inflation that was going on there. So you can imagine the internal pressure. So again, playing the card that we're a strong power, that I'm in control, I think you're right, it's Putin reacting to the domestic pressures.
OK, Crispin Williams, thanks very much for talking to us, and we'll come back to you a little bit later and look at some of the other front pages. Well, let's take a look now at some of the other stories making the headlines of the international newspaper front pages. And I'm joined again by the political commentator and broadcaster, Crispin Williams. Crispin, good to see you again.
Yep.
Let's have a look at the front page of the Kathimerini newspaper in Greece. Obviously, it will be talking about the possible deal that will be discussed today. And its headline is that the Eurozone deal hangs in the balance.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see the different perspective. Obviously, we saw a more international perspective earlier. Now we're looking within the country, and most notably, it says that talks were held in a positive tone between Merkel and Tsipras. So you're already seeing that it's being played, that it is sort of positive, we can get something here. A few more interesting details of some of the background around the intricacy of the actual deal. So things such as the Greek government is willing to sort of look at the legally binding deal that happened before, but take out a few words such as memorandum or programme, making it a little bit looser. This is what we've talked about, so that, the austerity isn't quite as wedged into the actual document. And also a bit more about the German position of the supposed Trojan horse force, that this is all a ploy, to try and get bridging finance through so they can basically move forward on this. So interesting perspective there, and obviously we were just talking about the picture on the front with the salute to the Chinese Navy as well. So looking at all different ways to engage, get money in, and the future for Greece.
Well, it's almost saying that picture that, you know, this isn't the last chance. There are other options, and we know that Greece has been mentioning that it was looking to China to perhaps for funding if something can't be sorted out with the European Union.
And I'd be very interested to see what's the other side of that deal for China, because obviously you're thinking with all the issues that Greece has, we know China has been going out and making a lot of friends internationally, typically if they've got raw resources in Africa and other places we've seen. So I mean, we haven't seen too much. I mean, that alludes to it with the salute there, but actually what would be the basis of that? But also I question whether they could get it in the time frame that's needed, because remember we talked about it, they've got a week to try and fill this hole where the 240 billion will run out. China may be longer term, but they still need to come back to the table with the EU and Germany and find a solution.
Because it's a very difficult situation that Tsipras is in, especially the way that he campaigned on being hard. We will not accept these deals that are being foisted upon us by the European Union. But now when it comes to actually trying to make a deal, he's got to change his language and try and negotiate.
Well, you're right, and I think that language was the word that you picked out there. People can be cynical about politicians, and some of the leaked information about wanting to change certain words, like a sort of memorandum, in essence, it's not changing what Greece is going to do, but he could go back to the Greek people and say, look, we're not bound by a programme or a memorandum. There is a bit more wiggle room. Whether there would be wiggle room in reality is a very different matter of fact, but he can go back and claim success because, as you say, he was voted in on a mandate of not agreeing to this harsh austerity measures that people in Greece have been struggling with.
And other countries like Spain must be watching this very eagerly and seeing how this is going to play out for their own issues.
Yes, most definitely, because that's the other side of the coin. If Greece is treated differently and they change the scenario of Greece, what about Spain? What about Portugal? What about some of the other countries that have had to change their economic frameworks to try and deal with the pressures of the financial crisis? Maybe they will come back to try and renegotiate, and this, I think, is part of the reason why there is hardball from both sides, because there's big stakes. It might be the government in Greece that loses a lot of popularity for the EU. They might start having people knocking on their door again.
Certainly interesting to see how that plays out. Now we'll go and have a look at the front page of the Moscow Times, and it has a headline, Kiev ex-elite find haven in Moscow.
Well, it's sort of looking at life after, exile, I suppose, for the former Ukrainian leadership, Yanukovych and his sort of senior cabinet members, and saying what are they actually doing with themselves now, and the fact that many of them have moved in sort of affluent parts of Moscow. Some are sort of becoming quite wealthy businessmen. His son Alex, who's opened new businesses there and doing very well. Others are writing books. One interesting thing, though, I mean, obviously it shows the continuing strength of relations there between the old pro-Russian Ukrainian leadership and Russia, but also looking at some of the close links between business and politics in Russia. So we see that, as I'll say, Zakharichenko, who's I think the former interior minister, that he's now become a consultant on Rostec, their big state corporation. So again, you're seeing about the closeness of politics and business and power and how things work there. But no, very much having quite a good life, it sounds like, in Russia afterwards.
And it's interesting to note how, because it's 12 months since the most bloody uprising at Maidan, when 77 protesters and 18 police officers were killed. But it just sort of has the timeline of how he actually left Ukraine and made it into Russia, first going into Crimea, or trying to fly out of Donetsk, then the plane wasn't scheduled for takeoff, then going into Crimea, then managing to get out, and then Crimea was annexed.
No, very much so, and it does sort of show the both precarious nature of how he just made it out, but also the support that Russia was giving to make sure that he did get out. You know, it's important that he didn't become a scapegoat or have a trial or other things in Ukraine. They got their guy out. But as you say, it was quite a journey. I wouldn't have liked to have been his assistant there running with the bags.
And the other one saying that the ruble's fall saw $22 billion in US bonds dump. And that's also just highlighting how precarious the situation is also for the Russian economy in this situation.
Well, we've talked about it for a long time now. Pressure from the falling prices in oil, the economic sanctions. I think last year they got through 124 billion of their foreign currency reserves, showing just how serious it was. And obviously this is talking about 22 billion of them. So they are in precarious times, and as we've seen with some of the flights of the bombers over other countries, trying to sort of show power because of this dwindling economic situation in Russia. But what I think is interesting about this story as well is it alludes to a sort of future that maybe Putin is trying to move towards. The fact that now that they've got rid of this foreign currency from the US, they're looking at alternative sources of foreign currency from the BRIC nations, the Brazils, the Indias, the Chinas, to try and get currency away from traditional enemies as perceived, like the US and maybe some of the European countries, because obviously they're involved in the sanctions. And obviously this comes off the back, I think, a few months ago of Putin going to India and trying to sign oil deals and civil nuclear deals. So you can see how they're trying to recalibrate their economic strength towards the emerging nations, if you want to call that, and the BRIC nations they're called. But again, I don't think they've got the time to do that, and they've got to come back to the EU, their biggest trading partner, and try and work some sort of deal out around these sanctions.
I think we've got time for a quick look at the front page of the Australian newspaper now, which says, double trouble as cyclones become superstorms. Now, we've got two cyclones hitting the top of Australia. We've got freezing weather in the United States.
Yeah.
It does sort of point that
it's
there's
climate change back with a vengeance, isn't it, really? I mean, it's the extreme nature of this weather. And it's becoming more frequent. I think that's the point as well, as you say, two cyclones off Australia, but also record low temperatures on the east coast of the US. And I think it reminds us we're looking very much at man-made conflicts. You know, we've got Ukraine, we've had troubles elsewhere in the globe. But remember that natural disasters have played a big role in the last few years. You had the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, the Japanese tsunami. We might be seeing more of this in 2015, where natural disasters, I would say, caused by climate change and what we've been doing, some would dispute that, but I think, you know, it's pointing more and more towards that, are going to come back onto the agenda. We're only into February and already we're seeing these extreme temperatures and cyclones coming through. So again, you know, watch that space on the natural disaster front for 2015.
And it's also something that the international community has to come together, because we've got very differing plans. Some are looking at emissions trading schemes and taxes on carbon and things that other countries are totally ignoring it. Australia initially, interestingly, had a carbon tax, and then the Conservative government came in and said they'd get rid of it, yet it's now facing similar sort of climate issues.
Well, again, you're right, Tony Abbott came in very hard on this line, didn't want to do it, got a lot of pressure internationally to move back from this. But I think on the wider point you raise about international coordination, ever since the end of the Kyoto Protocol, we've seen a number of times at Copenhagen, more recently in the US as well, the attempt to establish an international sort of framework that's more than just political talk shop, that actually means something, and the failure to do that, and how the both emerging nations who are making a lot of pollution, the Chinas, etc., and our sort of industrialised nations work on this, and who pays for what, is still to be decided. And I think it's going to take a few more years, but they need to decide something soon.
Certainly an interesting point. Crispin Williams, good to talk to you this morning and review the newspapers. Thank you.
Thank you.